Pretty much everyone is familiar with musical movies. They're the type of movie that your common theater kid watches and thinks to themselves, I can do that, and their lives would never be the same since. Musicals and musical movies occupy a very specific place in the world of entertainment, arguably being regarded as a niche genre in the same manner of horror media. Horror and musical movies have a lot in common. For one, they're not considered to be as financially safe as drama, comedy, and action films are. They're also genres that are considered to appeal to niche audiences, and are something that, for the most part, Hollywood doesn't seem to know what to do with. As someone who adores both horror and musical movies, especially when they blend together, I couldn't help but wonder why musical movies find themselves in a revolving door of popularity. In celebration of the Wicked era, we're going to look into how musical films have evolved over time, and why they go in and out of style. So now, let's get started. Musical movies have existed since film included sound. The first real musical movie by modern definitions is The Broadway Melody, released in 1929. But for these types of early films, plots were very thin, with audiences pretty much coming to see them to hear music. Director Busby Berkeley was a big contributor to the popularity of musical films in the 1930s. His work showcased elaborate set designs and fast drill-like choreography, which he took from his experience of being a soldier in World War I. Musicals were greatly pushed by studios, regularly having plots that were centered on show business, which gives a good excuse to showcase intricate dance numbers. Some of the most notable works starred Broadway alumni Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Hollywood officially became the dominant entertainment media in American culture. Some of the most popular songs of the time were from musicals. Given that this was the decade of the Great Depression, cinema was designed as a temporary escape from a difficult economic period. Taking lots of inspiration from the hardships of the Great Depression, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs revolutionized musicals as it was the first full-length animated film, and broke the record for the most financially successful movie of the time. Making musical movies based on children's fairy tales proved to be very lucrative, and was the model that Disney would be famous for ever since. MGM took notes from this and produced the iconic Technicolor film, The Wizard of Oz. This was the 8th and most expensive movie adaptation of the novel, while being the first to include music. When you look into the production of this movie, just knowing about all the reshoots and directorial rehires already sounds exhausting. While it wasn't an instant classic upon its release, it's still one of the most notable musicals from the 1930s. In the 1940s, MGM produced more musicals, with Judy Garland being a regular star. This period saw more struggles with the Second World War and its aftermath. Musicals continued to operate as a fantastical escape for the general public. Some of these films were set in the distant past, giving them a nostalgic factor. It just proves that no matter what time people live in, they'll forever reminisce on how the past was so much better. That isn't exactly true for everyone, but anyways, in the 1950s, musicals continued to be in public demand. This period had some of the most famous and most referenced images in cinema. This was when Gene Kelly happily sang in Rain, which was actually milk water. Marilyn Monroe would also sing about diamonds, and would inspire millions of other scenes decades later. Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend has been generally regarded as a gold digger anthem, when in actuality, it's a satire of people's perceptions. Long story short, don't be a hater. To me, musicals of this time reflected the essence of the golden age of Hollywood. Everything was larger than life. With elaborate set designs and costumes, they were more than just movies. They were experiences. By the later half of the decade, Hollywood's studio system would begin to shake up when film studios no longer owned theaters, and with the growing competition of television. TV didn't have the production levels that movies had, but it still gave the public something new and exciting. To remarket musical movies, roadshows were becoming a popular release format. Modeling themselves after live musicals, roadshow screenings were in an upscale environment, presented in widescreen, and most importantly, were more expensive than typical film screenings. And they included an intermission or two for ultimate operatic vibes. These movies would go on tour in various major cities before their standard release. The 1960s was a very interesting period for musicals. There were so many famous titles coming out at the same time. To compete with TV content, musicals were more colorful and expensive looking than ever before. 1964 was a particularly good year since it gave us Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady. There was some tiny microdrama with these two films. Julie Andrews gained popularity starring in My Fair Lady, but in the movie adaptation, Audrey Hepburn ended up with the role. But it's okay, because Andrews would have her signature role in Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins ended up being slightly more successful in the box office than My Fair Lady. But Lady won Best Picture, so yeah. Basically, if social media existed in this time, I just know that people would be acting very messy. The direction of Mary Poppins was to be as upbeat as possible, even changing the original 1930s setting to the Edwardian era, as it was considered a happier time in the UK. This was also the same setting in My Fair Lady, and had one of the most iconic movie dresses. In 1965, The Sound of Music was the most financially successful movie in film history, and would be the second time in a row that a musical would win Best Picture at the Oscars. With these types of movies being so popular, more musicals were being produced, but to their detriment. For instance, there was Camelot, which had a Wizard of Oz level of stressful production, and ended up being financially underwhelming. The same thing happened to Dr. Dolittle, which I'm guessing created the rule of Hollywood to never work with animals, and earned only half of its budget. When Hello Dolly came out and flopped at the box office, it was apparent that big production musical films were over. Just a few years before, people seemed to love these movies, and I had to investigate what went wrong. For one, like with anything that gets immensely popular, musicals were becoming overexposed, and simply put, the general public was getting tired of them. Studios also started over-relying on roadshows, which prided itself on its exclusivity, so that plot was lost. Another reason was the style of popular music was changing, especially for kids and teenagers. Broadway-style musical numbers were sounding old-fashioned with the mainstreaming of rock music. Remember that this was the 1960s. There were faster and more modern-sounding bops that people could vibe to. And a massive contributor to the decline of musicals was the end of the studio system and the restrictive Hays Code in 1968. In a changing world, 1950s-style old Hollywood became a thing of the past, and musicals with a quote-unquote safe aura to them were starting to feel tired. But musicals didn't necessarily vanish. They just started to look different. New Hollywood was characterized for rebelling against the previous movie structure. These new types of films were stylized to resemble reality in performances and dialogue, as well as showcasing formerly underrepresented subject matter. But the biggest change was when directors became vital aspects of a movie, instead of whoever's in charge of a studio. One notable director was Bob Fosse. His directorial debut was Sweet Charity, and was a huge financial disappointment, almost bankrupting Universal Pictures. But that shouldn't take away how impactful it would become. But still, Fosse needed something to save his career, and reusing the old formula is not going to cut it. He wanted to make a movie that reflected how the world truly is, so he turned to a semi-autobiographical novel, Cabaret, which told a story about living in Berlin during the Jazz Age. Cabaret was darkly shot, gritty, and had song numbers that were only diegetic, or in a performance setting. It pretty much innovated indie sleaze. Cabaret was the 6th most successful movie of 1972, and revolutionized the image of musical movies for a new era. Around the same time, the Rocky Horror Picture Show was one of the first musicals to have an alternative essence. It was pulled from theaters after a single weekend, but gained a fan base after its running in the midnight movie circuit. Fans loved this movie for it being a parody and tribute to sci-fi/horror films, all while having a deliberately campy tone. Grease in 1978 was extremely successful and opened the doors for high school musicals. Get it? The soundtrack was also massive and features songs that people still recognize today. And while I'm here, I will say that the sequel is overhated. During the 1980s, musicals started experimenting even more with different genres, including science fiction, horror, and fantasy. For instance, Labyrinth was a dark fantasy film intended to be a lighter version of The Dark Crystal, and while it didn't excel at the box office, it would later become a cult film. There was also Little Shop of Horrors, which, like Rocky Horror, was heavily inspired by low-budget horror films. And I will say that this is the best musical movie of the 1980s. But compared to other genres, a lot of musical movies just weren't pulling in the box office numbers that studios desire. In the 80s, it seemed like horror films instead of musicals were excelling in the world of divisive movie genres. But it's important to note that because this is the era where the music industry was the highest it's ever been, movies that were about music and dancing brought in a large audience. In the next decade, Disney ruled the musical genre. The Little Mermaid returned the fairy tale and princess model that they were famous for, and had music done in the typical Broadway style. The 90s would be the most successful period Disney has ever seen for the time, but you could say that animated musicals are in a different realm. Evita in 1996 was instantly successful. This was a prestige film telling a fictionalized version of Eva Perón, who was the First Lady of Argentina from 1946 to 1952, whose story would become a musical. Casting a controversial figure like Madonna to portray Perón was considered a risky decision, but she broke a record for most costume changes for a film where she had 85 different outfits, so that has to count for something. While this film wasn't revolutionary, it opened the doors to relaunch a new generation of grandiose musical films. The jukebox musical Moulin Rouge proved that the public still desired these types of movies. The concept was to create an unambiguously crowd-pleasing Hollywood movie. As director Baz Luhrmann stated, "Our recognizable story, though Orphean in shape, is derived from Camille, La Boheme. Whether you know these texts or not, you recognize these patterns and character types." The character Satine was modeled after classic musical stars such as Rita Hayworth and Marilyn Monroe, which was exemplified in The Diamonds Number. The visuals resembled an early Technicolor film, while the editing was fast-paced in the style of a music video, which is now a trademark for Luhrmann. In 2002, the public got to see a favorite musical film for many. The movie Chicago was based on the Broadway show, which was based on 2 real-life court cases. The story focuses on the idea of 15 minutes of fame, which is a very interesting watch in the social media age. While I could tell you the entire soundtrack list, Cell Block Tango is probably the most famous scene, where it tells 6 different stories of crime or revenge. It's up for you to decide. This scene has been referenced numerous times, and from my experience, this was a regular concept in the dance competition world. Cell Block Tango is probably the movie's signature scene, though We Both Reach for the have recently got some traction. From the songs, choreography, and costumes, everyone involved knew what they were doing, and the public loved every moment of it. Chicago was the first musical in 34 years to win an Academy Award for Best Picture. Throughout the 2000s, there were quite a few high-budget successful musical movies. For instance, people seem very divided on Joel Schumacher's Phantom of the Opera, but it certainly got people talking, and I'm surprised that there weren't any memes that came out of this. Dreamgirls had the song Listen, which I would say is one of Beyoncé's best, and Hairspray has a very recognizable song list for your standard musical theater fan. The song I Can Hear the Bells is what plays when anyone's crush is looking at their general direction for a microsecond. Modern technology and choreography styles allowed musicals of the 2000s to appeal to a general audience. It seemed like so many musicals all at once were excelling in the box office, and this momentum continued in the 2010s. Kind of. La La Land is probably the most notable musical of the 2010s, not counting Disney, since that's what the public expects from them at this point. Similarly to Moulin Rouge, La La Land took inspiration from the sound and style of old Hollywood musicals. Though this movie was very acclaimed, I've never directly heard anyone say they loved this movie, but I don't want to start too much mess. But it was sites like Tumblr that kept the excitement of musical films alive. It's actually how I first heard about The Greatest Showman. This was also the era of the musical biopic, which I see regularly being referred to as musicals, but personally I wouldn't put them in that category. There's musical films, and then there's movies about music, if that makes sense. And in the 2020s, I feel like musicals have once again found themselves in a weird place. Recently, there's been a few musical releases, many of which didn't leave much of a cultural impact and underperformed at the box office. But this could be attributed to the thing that happened in 2020. But in the 2023 and 2024 movie seasons, there were a few musicals coming out at the same time, having the common theme of not including music in their trailers. And of course, they're made as updated properties of movies that already exist. For instance, Mean Girls is filled with references from the 2004 movie, albeit with some added scenes of social media. And knowing the general response from fans, I'm not sure if this movie or the Bratz collab were more of a disappointment. If they wanted to remake a Broadway musical based on a high school movie, they should have stuck to Heathers. And no, I'm not referring to that one. And then comes Wicked, which as of writing this, is days away from its premiere. From what I'm seeing, the costuming has been praised, but some have criticized the film for not appearing as colorful and saturated like it could have been. They might be trying to come across as edgy, but it has been noted that a better choice for the aesthetics is to take a color palette similar to what Barbie had. But at least the trailers didn't hide that this is a musical. This is one of the most talked about movies of the season, and I predict that it's going to be at least somewhat financially successful. I'm not sure how Wicked is going to set up the future for musicals, but we'll just have to wait and see. I will be making a video on my thoughts of Wicked once it comes out, so I'm very much looking forward to that. The criticisms people have of musicals didn't change for almost a century. After all, it's not realistic for people to burst into song and dance, though people are willing to suspend their disbelief for other things. But musicals intrinsically have a dramatic and theatrical essence to them, which is how they found an audience. But at the same time, musicals are considered to have a niche quality to them. They allow their cast to flourish and display their talents. Movies of certain genres don't have to go in and out of style. Ideally, they can enjoy their individual wins with their target audiences. And that's all I have for the changing image of musical movies. This was a lot of fun for me to look into, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye!